History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 8 The Latest Age. Chapter 1 Perspectives. Science and Nature. By 1950, modern industry was already dependent on science and scientists, directly or indirectly, obviously or not, acknowledged or not. Moreover, the transformation of fundamental science into end products was by then often very rapid and has continued to accelerate in most areas of technology. A substantial generalization of the use of the motor car after the grasping of the principle of the internal combustion engine took about half a century. In recent times, the microchip made handheld computers possible in about 10 years. Technological progress is still the only way in which large numbers of people become aware of the importance of science. Yet, there have been important changes in the way in which it has come to shape their lives. In the 19th century, most practical results of science were still often byproducts of scientific curiosity. Sometimes they were even accidental. By 1900, a change was underway. Some scientists had seen that consciously directed and focused research was sensible. 20 years later, large industrial companies were beginning to see research as a proper call on their investment, albeit a small one. Some industrial research departments were, in the end, to grow into enormous establishments in their own right as petrochemicals, plastics, electronics, and biochemical medicines made their appearance. Nowadays, the ordinary citizen of a developed country cannot lead a life that does not rely on applied science. This all pervasiveness, coupled with its impressiveness in its most spectacular achievements, was one of the reasons for the ever growing recognition, even given to science. Money is one yardstick. The Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge, for example, in which some of the fundamental experiments of nuclear physics were carried out before 1914, had then a grant from the university of about £300 a year, roughly $1,500 at rates then current. When during the War of 1939 to 1945, the British and Americans decided that a major effort had to be mounted to produce nuclear weapons. The resulting Manhattan Project, as it was called, is estimated to have cost as much as all the scientific research previously conducted by mankind from the beginnings of the recorded time. Such huge sums, and there were to be given larger bills to meet in the post war world, mark another momentous change, the new importance of science to government. After being for centuries the object of only occasional patronage by the state, it now became a major political concern. Only governments could provide resources on the scale needed for some of the things done since 1945. One benefit they usually sought was better weapons, which explained such much of the huge scientific investment of the United States and the Soviet Union. The increasing interest and participation of governments has not, on the other hand, meant that science has grown more national. Indeed, the reverse is true. The tradition of international communication among scientists is one of their most splendid inheritances from the first great age of science in the 17th century. But even without it, science would jump national frontiers for purely theoretical and technical reasons. Once again, the historical context is complex and deep. Already before 1914, it was increasingly clear that boundaries between the individual sciences, some of them intelligible and usefully distinct fields of study since the 17th century, were tending to blur and then to disappear. The full implications of this have only begun to appear very lately, however. For all the achievements of the great chemists and biologists of the 18th and 19th century, it was the physicists who did most to change the scientific map of the 20th century. James Clerk Maxwell, the first professor of experimental physics at Cambridge, published in the 1870s the work in electromagnetism, which first broke effectively into fields and problems left untouched by Newtonian physics. Maxwell's theoretical work and its experimental investigation profoundly affected the accepted view that the universe obeyed natural, regular, and discoverable laws of a somewhat mechanical kind, and that it consisted essentially of indestructible matter in various combinations and arrangements. Into this picture had now to be fitted the newly discovered electromagnetic fields, whose technological possibilities quickly fascinated laymen and scientists alike. The crucial work that followed and that founded modern physical theory was done between 1895 and 1914 by Rontgen, who discovered X rays, Becquerel, who discovered radioactivity, Thomson, who discovered the electron, the Curies, who isolated radium, and Rutherford, who investigated the structure of the atom. They made it possible to see the physical world in a new way. Instead of lumps of matter, the universe began to look more like an aggregate of atoms, which were tiny solar systems of particles held together by electrical forces in different arrangements. These particles seemed to behave in a way that blurred the distinction between matter and electromagnetic fields. Moreover, such arrangements of particles were not fixed, for in nature one arrangement might give way to another, and thus elements could change into their elements. Rutherford's work, in particular, was decisive for he established the atoms could be split because of their structure as a system of particles. This meant that matter, even at this fundamental level, could be manipulated. Two such particles were soon identified, the proton and the electron. Others were not isolated until after 1932, when Chadwick discovered the neutron. The scientific world now had an experimentally validated picture of atoms' structure as a system of particles. But as late as 1935, Rutherford said that nuclear physics would have no practical implications, and no one rushed to contradict him. What this radically important experimental work did not at once do was supply a new theoretical framework to replace the Newtonian system. This only came with a long revolution in theory, beginning in the last years of the 19th century and culminating in the 1920s. It was focused on two different sets of problems which gave rise to the work designated by the terms relativity and quantum theory. The pioneers were Max Planck and Albert Einstein. By 1905, they had provided experimental and mathematical demonstration that the Newtonian laws of motion were an inadequate framework for explanation of the fact no longer to be contested that energy transactions in the material world took place not in an even flow but in discrete jumps, quanta as they came to be termed. Planck showed that radiant heat from, for example, the sun was not, as Newtonian physics required, emitted continuously. He argued that this was true of all energy transactions. Einstein argued that light was propagated not continuously but in particles, though much important work was to be done in the next 20 or so years. Planck's contribution had the most profound effect, and it was again unsettling. Newton's views had been found wanting, but there was nothing to put in their place. Meanwhile, after his work on quanta,
Einstein had published in 1905 the work for which he was to be most widely, if uncomprehendingly, celebrated, his statement of the theory of relativity. This was essentially a demonstration that the traditional distinctions of space and time and mass and energy could not be consistently maintained. Instead of Newton's three dimensional physics, he directed men's attention to a space time continuum in which the interplay of space, time, and the motion could be understood. This was soon to be corroborated by astronomical observation of facts for which Newtonian cosmology could not properly account, but which could find a place in Einstein's theory. One strange and unanticipated consequence of the work on which relativity theory was based was his demonstration of the relations of mass and energy, which he formulated as E is equal to mc square, where E is the energy, m is the mass, and c is the constant speed of light. The importance of accuracy of this theoretical formulation was not to become clear until much more nuclear physics had been done. It would then be apparent that the relationships observed when mass energy was converted into heat energy in the breaking up of nuclei also corresponded to his formula. While these advances were absorbed, attempts continued to rewrite physics, but they did not get far until a major theoretical breakthrough in 1926 finally provided a mathematical framework for Planck's observations and indeed for nuclear physics. So sweeping was the achievement of Schrödinger and Heisenberg, the two mathematicians mainly responsible, that it seemed for a time as if quantum mechanics might be of virtually limitless explanatory power in the sciences. The behavior of particles in an atom observed by Rutherford and Bohr could now be accounted for. Further development of their work led to predictions of the existence of new nuclear particles, notably the positron, which was duly identified in the 1930s. The discovery of the new particles continued. Quantum mechanics seemed to have inaugurated a new age of physics. By mid century, much more had disappeared in science than just a once accepted set of general laws, and in any case, it remained true that, for most everyday purposes, Newtonian physics was still all that was needed. In physics, from which it had spread to other sciences, the whole notion of a general law was being replaced by the concept of statistical probability as the best that could be hoped for. The idea as well as the content of science was changing. Furthermore, the boundaries between the sciences collapsed under the onrush of the new knowledge made accessible by new theories and instrumentation. Any one of the great traditional divisions of science was soon beyond the grasp of one single mind. The conflations involved in importing physical theory into neurology and mathematics into biology put further barriers in the way of attaining that synthesis of knowledge that had been the dream of the 19th century, just as the rate of acquisition of new knowledge, some in such quantities that it could only be handled by the newly available computers, became faster than ever. Such considerations did nothing to diminish either the prestige of the scientists or the faith that they were mankind's best hope for the better management of its future. Doubts, when they came, arose from other sources than their inability to generate an overarching theory as intelligible to lay understanding as Newton's had been. Meanwhile, the flow of specific advances in the sciences continued. In a measure, the baton passed after 1945 from the physical to biological or life sciences. Their current success and promise have once again deep roots. The 17th century invention of the microscope had first revealed the organization of tissue into discrete units called cells. In the 19th century, investigators already understood that cells could divide and that they developed individually. Cell theory, widely accepted by 1900, suggested that individual cells, being alive themselves, provided a good approach to the study of life, and the application of chemistry to this became one of the main avenues of biological research. Another mainline advance in the 19th century biological science was provided by a new discipline, genetics, the study of the inheritance by offspring of characteristics from the parents. Darwin had invoked inheritance as the means of propagation of traits favored by natural selection. The first steps towards understanding the mechanism that made this possible were those of an Austrian monk, Gregor Mendel, in the 1850s and 1860s. From a meticulous series of breeding experiments on pea plants, Mendel concluded that there existed hereditary units controlling the expression of traits passed from parents to offsprings. In 1909, a Dane gave them the name genes. Gradually, the chemistry of cells became better understood and the physical reality of genes was accepted. In 1873, the presence in the cell nucleus of a substance that might embody the most fundamental determinant of all living matter was already established. Experiments revealed a visible location for genes in chromosomes, and in the 1940s, it was shown that genes controlled the chemical structure of proteins, the most important constituent of cells. In 1944, the first step was taken towards identifying the specific effect agent in bringing about changes in certain bacteria, and therefore in controlling protein structure. In the 1950s, it was at last identified as DNA, whose physical structure, the double helix, was established in 1953. The crucial importance of this substance, its full name is deoxyribonucleic acid, is that it is the carrier of the genetic information that determines the synthesis of protein molecules at the basis of life. The chemical mechanisms underlying the diversity of biological phenomena were at last accessible. Physiologically and perhaps psychologically, this implied a transformation of man's view of himself unprecedented since the diffusion of Darwinian ideas in the last century. The identification and analysis of the structure of DNA was the most conspicuous single step towards a new manipulation of nature, the shaping of life forms. Already in 1947, the word biotechnology had been coined. Once again, not only more scientific knowledge but also new definitions of fields of study and new applications followed. Molecular biology and genetic engineering, like biotechnology, quickly became familiar terms. The genes of some organisms could, it was shown, be altered so as to give those organisms new and desirable characteristics. By manipulating their growth processes, yeast and other microorganisms could be made to produce novel substances too, enzymes, hormones, or other chemicals. This was one of the first applications of the new science. The technology and data accumulated empirically and informally for thousands of years in making bread, beer, wine, and cheese was at last to be overtaken. Genetic modification of bacteria could now grow new compounds. By the end of the 20th century, three-quarters of the soya grown in the United States was the product of genetically modified seed, while agricultural producers like Canada, Argentina, and Brazil were also raising huge genetically modified crops. More dramatically, by the end of the 1980s, there was underway a worldwide collaborative investigation
the Human Genome Project. Its almost unimaginably ambitious aim was the mapping of the human genetic apparatus, the position, structure, and function of every human gene, of which there were said to be from 30,000 to 50,000 in every cell, each gene having up to 30,000 pairs of four basic chemical units that form the genetic code, was to be identified. As the century closed, it was announced that the project had been completed. Shortly afterwards, the sobering discovery was made that human beings possessed only about twice the number of genes as the fruit fly, substantially fewer than had been expected. The door had been opened to a great future for manipulation of nature at a new level, and what that might mean was already visible in a Scottish laboratory in the form of the first successfully cloned sheep. Already, too, the screening for the presence of defective genes is a reality, and the replacement of some of them is possible. The social and medical implications are tremendous. At a day to day level, what is called DNA fingerprinting is now a matter of routine in police work in identifying individuals from blood, saliva, or semen samples. By 2005, it was becoming clear that genetic engineering would shape a substantial part of our future. In spite of the controversy created by many research programs in this field, the new microorganisms created by geneticists are now patentable and therefore commercially available in many parts of the world. Likewise, genetically modified crops are used to increase yields through the creation of more resistant and more productive strains, thereby giving some regions their first ever opportunity to become self sufficient in staple foods. But while providing obvious benefits, biotechnology has also come under scrutiny for delivering food products that may not be safe and for the increasing dominance of large multinational corporations in both research and production worldwide. Such concerns have, for obvious reasons, become particularly strong when genetic research on human material has been involved, such as in work on stem cells from embryos. Many scientists fail to realize how the matters they are dealing with raise immense concerns among the public, mostly because of warnings from the history of the 20th century. Progress in these matters has owed much of its startling rapidity to the availability of new computer power, another instance of the acceleration of scientific advance, so as both to provide faster applications of new knowledge and to challenge more quickly the world of settled assumptions and landmarks. With new ideas that must be taken into account by laymen. Yet, it remains as hard as ever to see what such challenges imply or may mean. For all the huge recent advances in the life sciences, it is doubtful that even their approximate importance is sensed by more than tiny minorities. Space, a new environment for mankind. For a brief period in the middle of the 20th century, the power of science was above all visible in the exploration of space. Such an extension of the human environment may well turn out one day to dwarf in significance other historical processes, but as yet shows no sign of doing so. Yet it suggests that the capacity of human culture to meet unprecedented challenges is as great as ever, and it provided what is so far the most spectacular example of human domination of nature. For most people, the space age began in October 1957 when an unmanned Soviet satellite called Sputnik I was launched by rocket and could soon be discerned in orbit around the Earth, emitting radio signals. Its political impact was vast. It shattered the belief that Russian technology lagged significantly behind American. The full significance of the events, though, was still obscured because superpower rivalries swamped other considerations for most observers. In fact, it ended the era when the possibility of human travel in space could still be doubted. Thus, almost incidentally, it marked a break in historical continuity as important as the European discovery of the Americas or the Industrial Revolution. Visions of space exploration could be found in the last years of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th, when they were brought to the notice of the Western public in fiction, notably in the story of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. Its technology went back almost as far. A Russian scientist, K.E. Tsiolkovsky, had designed multi staged rockets and devised many of the basic principles of space travel. And he too had written fiction to popularize his obsession well before 1914. The first Soviet liquid fuel rocket went up 3 miles in 1933 and a two-stage rocket 6 years later. The Second World War prompted a major German rocket program, which the United States had drawn on to begin its own program in 1955. It started with more modest hardware than the Russians, who already had a commanding lead, and the first American satellite weighed only 3 pounds. Sputnik the first weighed 184 pounds. A much publicized launch attempt was made at the end of December 1957, but the rocket caught fire instead of taking off. The Americans would soon do much better than this, but within a month of Sputnik the first, the Russians had already put up Sputnik the second, an astonishingly successful machine, weighing half a ton and carrying the first passenger in space, a black and white mongrel called Laika. For nearly 6 months, Sputnik II orbited the Earth, visible to the whole inhabited world and enraging thousands of dog lovers, for Laika was not to return. The Russian and American space programs had by then somewhat diverged. The Russians, building on their pre war experience, had put much emphasis on power and size of their rockets, which could lift big loads, and here and there strength continued to lie. The military implications were more obvious than those, equally profound and less spectacular, which flowed from American concentration on data gathering and on instrumentation. A competition for prestige was soon underway, but although people spoke of a space race, the contestants were running towards somewhat different goals, with one great exception: the wish to be the first to put a man on in space. Their technical decisions were probably not much influenced by one another's performance. The contrast was clear enough when Vanguard, the American satellite that failed in December 1957, was successfully launched the following March. Tiny though it went much deeper into space than any predecessor and provided more valuable scientific information in proportion to its size and in comparison to any other satellite. It is likely to be going around for another couple of centuries or so.